Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the webinar series, Embracing Change. Today, we have the honor and privilege to have Philip Marcovici back with us to discuss a topic that he normally doesn't discuss, but of course, it plays a huge part in the ability to be able to create the harmony, the continuity that he obviously is involved with many of the families that are attending today and beyond. Today, we're going to discuss state of being, which is on top of having the energy, having your presence and engagement, and having the calmness and centeredness in order to be responsive rather than reactive. It's on top of that where, how do we show up? Are we showing up with imposition? Are we showing up with expectation? And are we showing up with judgment? And we're going to look at this in different realms. We're going to look at this as a sibling, as a parent, as a spouse, as an in-law, as a patriarch, matriarch. And we're going to do this through a case study that that Philip and I have worked through, and we're just going to have a dialogue and see what shows up in terms of the education, what you do with your life, where do you go to school, who you become, what you inherit, the values, and beyond. I don't want to give it all away, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And so, Philip, once again, thank you very much. It's going to be a little different. We're going to have a dialogue. And thank you for taking the time. And why don't you present the elements, and then let's have some fun.
Okay, thanks, Faisal. As you said, this is in some ways not what I do in my day-to-day work with families, and in many other ways, has everything to do with what I do day-to-day with families. I tend to work, on more of the technical side of things, which is, helping families understand their own succession and asset protection structures, helping them understand how those structures work, the need for checks and balances to keep an eye on everyone, including family members and trustees and protectors, because nobody can be trusted. And so I'm dealing with all of these sort of, in a way, the hard issues. And the questions that you've raised for us to discuss today fall into what sometimes people refer to as the soft issues, which makes it sound like they're somehow less important because they're soft. In fact, I want to start off by saying that the soft issues are anything but soft, in the sense that they are actually the critical issues. And in my experience of working for many years as a legal and tax advisors, very often advisors tend to focus, of course, on the hard issues, which is what they really know about, which are the tax and legal and all of these kind of things, and almost no time at all on these soft issues of how people feel and the kind of things that we're going to be discussing today in terms of imposition, expectation, and judgment. And the problem that many families have, and the problems that many families face in the generations that follow, stem from this. They stem from not enough thinking about discussion and not enough challenge of family members who are coming into it in many cases with a lot of baggage that needs to be discussed and addressed. And when you see families in dispute, when you see unhappy family members, when you see businesses that get purchased at very good prices because a family is not handling the transition very well, when you see lawsuits among family members, it's coming from the family not having done the work to address the kind of things that we're discussing today. So just as a starting point, I want to say that no one has all the answers for any family. No advisor knows it all. And what you really need is a team approach and a holistic approach, which is balancing psychological issues, soft issues within the family, with the hard issues, which are, the legal and tax and all the other stuff that is in the arrangements. And so what our conversation this morning is about, or today is about, is really to try to look a little bit more holistically at all of this, and to put it in a very simple way, every single family that I work with is nuts. Every family is nuts. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a nasty way. What I mean is there is a reality that we all bring into relationships of family, relationships of business, and relationships that involve money. We all bring a lot of junk with us. And the more we're able to discuss this very openly within families, the more we can help in communication and then address the issues in the legal, correct way, the more we're able to achieve what we're trying to achieve, which is bottom line, happiness within the family, stability within the family business, and the creation of a legacy where the assets are not going to create misery and eventually disappear, but actually will be what they should be, which is a happy event for the family and something that can be sustained over the long term. So, with that as a bit of an introduction, let me make maybe some initial comments and then let you, Feisal, challenge and ask some questions. And as you said, what we're going to do is discuss a typical family. We'll look at a grandfather, a grandmother. We're going to look at the children. We're going to look at the in-laws. We'll look at the circle of business associates because it's not just family. And we'll look at friends. And we'll try within this 45 minutes or so that we have for our discussion to touch on each of these areas from the perspective of imposition, expectation, judgment. And let me start off by saying that expectation is not necessarily wrong or bad, in my view. In other words, it's very easy, in a sense, for a mental health professional of any kind, whether it's a friend or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, to say, well, you really should come into all relationships without any expectation. Come into it without judgment or imposition. Let's all be very innocent. The reality is there is expectation in every single relationship. And in my world, and where, what I focus on is the reality that money destroys families. Wealth at any level, it doesn't matter how much wealth is involved, money, in my view, comes into every relationship. And there are expectations in families that have to do with money. And I also believe that there is something called a legitimate expectation. And it's interesting because you raised with me, Feisal, in relation to this session, let's talk about expectation, judgment, and imposition. And I gave some thought, and in law, there actually is a concept of legitimate expectation. In other words, there's a concept that, for example, you're allowed to have reliance on the government that is taking care of you and to which you pay tax. You have a legitimate expectation that that government will act fairly. You have a legitimate expectation that they will look after certain things for you. And I think when we look at the family context, there are legitimate expectations between family members, and there are also unrealistic and illegitimate expectations that come up within family members. And I think we need to really, understand all of these things. But the goal at the end of the day for any family should be alignment. You want to create within the family an alignment of expectations with what is being imposed and then the judgments that do take place within the family. Is imposition wrong? As I said, expectation is kind of normal. You have expectations that your parents are going to act fairly. You have expectations your children will take care of you in your older age. You have certain expectations they're not going to sue you within the family. All of these expectations, I think, are reasonable and legitimate, but are not always followed within families. And similarly, there are some impositions that are actually necessary. A parent imposes certain things on the children in terms of their expectations, some rules and regulations, and some are legitimate, some are less legitimate. So as we move into looking at different family members, with that as a little bit of a context, let's talk about now some of the expectations, impositions that you see and some of the problems that you see. And if we start with grandfather, who may or may not be the wealth creator or the wealth owner. When I'm working with families, what's very important is to determine who is the wealth creator, who is the wealth owner. And sometimes it's not always that clear. you may have a grandfather, and we'll talk about grandmother shortly. You may have a grandfather who looks like he's the patriarch in the family. He looks and plays the role of the entrepreneur and the wealth owner. But you know, the matriarch, the grandmother, it may actually have been her family business or connections that actually made it all possible. It may have been her support. It may have been a combination of the two of them, but yet the grandfather is taking all the credit. That's going to have some issues psychologically between grandmother and grandfather, and the whole succession process that becomes very, very important. Because when we talk about the role of the grandmother shortly, she may have a more important role than the grandfather, because bottom line, women have a critically important role when we talk about wealth, because they always end up with the money. One way or the other, women will always end up with the money, either because they live longer than all the men in the family, or for other reasons that we can get into as we talk about relationships. But when we talk about grandfather and expectations and imposition and judgment, there are a lot of issues. There are issues around aging and changing demographics. This is a major, major issue, as people are now living much longer ages than was the case in the past. This transforms issues about inheritance and succession and all of these kind of things. If a dad is going to die at age 75 and his children inherit at age 50, that's a very different situation than when a father dies at 115 and his daughters and sons are all in their 80s. This affects the succession process. It affects many, many issues, including the question of the mental health of the older person as they move into forgetfulness, dementia, Alzheimer's, all of these things, which can have a great impact on the family. But getting more specific, and maybe I'll stop there for you to comment, is the biggest problem that I see in this sort of imposition, expectation, judgment area with the older generation, let's call it grandfather, is the natural desire to control using wealth and using the business assets. And I see this in families, and I as a parent, it's very hard to resist falling into this trap yourself from time to time. But even from a young age, children are sometimes controlled with wealth. If you're not good, you're not going to inherit. If you don't do what I tell you, you're not going to own part of the business. If you don't call your grandmother on her birthday, your cousin may call your grandmother on their birthday, and your grandmother may leave all her money to their kids. What I always say to the families that I work with is communication is something that we need to do in person, over the phone, using Zoom, whatever it might be. Usually it involves well-structured family retreats with advisors who help in the communication process. But what you don't want is communication with money. And in all too many families, communication is handled through money. And that causes the older generation, coming back to grandfather, to perhaps hold on to things for too long. And again, it links to the aging process and how long you live. But what I find very often is the older generation hesitate to let go and give assets to their children earlier, because they're afraid, if I give money to my kids aren't going to come visit me. They're not going to call me on my birthday. And then before you know it, as this combines with the aging process, this sense of wanting to hang on to everything becomes even more intense. And that creates even greater problems, because you're not giving the children the opportunity to actually spread their wings and run the business. And the whole issue of expectation is broken, because the children have, in my view, maybe a legitimate expectation that they'll be getting something from their parents. And then they're hanging on and hanging on and hanging on. And meanwhile, their life is on hold. They've made decisions based on those expectations, and that's a real mess. What I'm a great believer in is expectations should be reasonable, but also should be crystal clear and at a very young age. So if granddad is going to be hanging on to his dough until he's 110 and not handing it over to the children, they should know about that really, really early on. They should know about that when they're kids, so they can begin planning their own futures, recognizing they're not going to be part of getting family wealth until a long, 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 long time into the distant future.
No, I agree. I agree 100%. And I, I'd like to share from a perspective of teaching, what is our role, right? Our role, if you want your kids to be entrepreneurs, or if that's what your expectation or your desire is, I wouldn't say expectation, a desire, you're going to give them and teach them the ability to fish. And so there's the ability to fish versus fish, right? And when I sit with a lot of families, we talk about separating those two elements, right? That what is your, I would say, responsibility or obligation? I mean, we bring that also into account, right? What is your responsibility? And if we've given the ability to fish, or giving them the actual fishing farm, why do we need to give them fish? Right? Because once you give them fish, that fish can be used in ways that may not be aligned with your values. But then again, we go to the next step. We talked about this a few days ago, is that are the values that are instilled and aligned to what the next generation is actually resonates, or is it from the grandfather's generation? And how do the grandchildren feel? Because if you're already talking about somebody in their 80s, the grandchildren are already in their 20s and already able to be in the system, right? Now, how are they seeing it? But if there's no clarity, right, they're also in limbo.
And this is a good spot, Faisal, maybe for me to use this as a bit of an example of how the discussion we're having then relates to the actual legal structures that are then put in place for families. It's quite common for the older generation, and again, here we're talking about the grandfather, it's quite common for them to do something like putting their company in a trust, where they might say to the trustee, I want this company, this family business, to be in my family forever. No one has power to sell the family business. That's a kind of imposition. That's where the patriarch is basically saying, look, this is a great business. I want this in the family forever. And I don't trust my children and grandchildren to make the right decisions of the future. I'm going to impose through this legal vehicle of a trust. I'm going to impose my views forevermore. And this happens very, very often. And it's not just in trusts. You can do this in a variety of different ways. The problem is that we cannot predict what kind of a world we're going to have in the future. We cannot predict what businesses are going to be successful or not successful. If Li Ka-shing stayed in his plastic flower business, which is how he started his business, he wouldn't be the wealth and business owner that he is today. It's because the plastic flower business was sold and the proceeds were reinvested, or that business went bankrupt and he made another business. It's this dynamic nature of a family business that actually succeeds. And so there's need for coaching of the grandfather and the grandchildren and the children to all understand, what are we really moving towards, and what should be imposed, what are legitimate expectations, and when it comes to the children making their judgments, we need to give them some freedom within certain parameters, because they're the ones who are going to be carrying the bag in the future. And what you said about preparing the younger generation for their future roles, we don't know what those future roles will be. And it's not as black and white as today, where we say, well, what we're going to need is a CEO of the family business, and they need to learn the plastic flower business inside out. That may not be the skill that is going to bring this family forward into the future. The skill that may bring the family forward into the future may be entirely different. And letting the younger generation develop their own passions, but within an understanding of what their future role in the family business will be, this is critical. And here, I mean, there's so many things we can talk about, but I run into so many families who look to prune the family tree, to exit family members who are not driven to pursuing the family business. And sometimes this is a very big mistake in my view. I'm a great believer in what I call to be a revolving door. In other words, you may want to give exits to family members to leave the family business, to leave the family wealth. But what I'm a great believer in is having a revolving door where we plan for the ability of the children of that exiting child to maybe have a re-entry into the family business. By the way, which family business may be entirely different from what the family business was like when the grandfather originally set it up. Linked to this is also the notion of what I would call a family bank, where the family itself, it's not a formal bank, but the family itself may invest in unrelated businesses that the children set up. We encourage that. We encourage an entrepreneurial younger generation, and then have a mechanism for capturing that business that's been created as becoming a family enterprise. To make it really work, you need a lot of discussion around all these different areas. And if we look at it from grandfather's perspective, if I had to summarize the one biggest mistake that occurs, is that everyone is afraid to challenge grandfather. The advisors just write down what grandfather says and they put it into the documentation. The children are afraid to say anything against grandfather's interests. And then what happens is, once grandfather is not around anymore, that's when the mess happens of families fighting and arguing and things not working out. If at the time grandfather is thinking about all these things, there's someone brave enough like you to actually hold a mirror up to grandfather and to say, hang on a minute, I know what you're thinking, that you want to control everything until your very last breath. But might it be safer and better for family relationships to actually trust your children a little bit earlier, to actually equip them and to talk more clearly about what everyone in the family is entitled to make? You really want expectations to match, you know, the imposition and everything to be reasonable within the family.
Let me just tell you a very short story. So we helped a patriarch wanted to write a letter of wishes. And he wrote this letter of wishes with a professional like yourself, and came to me and he said, Faisal, you called me, he said, Faisal, I'd like you to read it. I said, sure. So I read the letter of wishes, made a few comments. You know, I'm a great believer of protecting the matriarchs. And so I kind of added a little more fish to the matriarch's pool. And then he thought that was it. And I turned to him and I said, you know, obviously it's an older gentleman. I said, Uncle, I said, can I suggest something? He said, what? I said, in your next family meeting, why don't you read your letter of wishes? And he's like, what? I said, why don't you read your letter of wishes so that there's clarity on your expectation while you're living, and so that you can actually execute what you would like while you're alive. And well, I promise you, for 30 seconds, he wanted to hit me. Okay. And then after that, he thought about it and he did it. And the incredible alignment and clarity that came. I'm not saying that all his wishes are going to come true. Okay. I'm not a guru or a god here, but it actually helped iron out the way forward for the next generation to be clear on what happens after our father is no longer there.
What you've just said is so critical and cannot be underestimated. You know, we all see these movies and television programs where people walk into the room and the lawyer is reading out the will. Nobody knows, you know, what is going to be said until that moment. And, you know, after the person has passed away, suddenly the family finds out what all the plans are. In my view, that's completely wrong. And exactly as you're saying. And what I observe in the work that I do and what I say to families is basically that most disputes within families are about what mom meant, what dad meant, what granddad meant. And what I say to mom and dad and granddad and grandma is, I want you in the room to explain to your family what you meant, rather than just writing it down. And then after the person has passed away, we're trying to, you know, interpret what mom and dad meant. The other thing to be very conscious of is that a typical letter of wishes in the context of a trust is a kind of standard document that the trustee or the lawyer has pressed a button and they printed off their word processor and they've just changed some of the names and some of the figures. And you're not really getting something that is truly expressing how grandfather, if we're talking about grandfather, really feels. And what I am now doing with a lot of families is I'm saying to them, the letter of wishes or the memorandum of wishes that you write or that the trustee writes in relation to a trust or whatever is one piece, but why not have a video interview of the grandfather where you, for example, Feisal, are interviewing the grandfather and saying, I have your letter of wishes where you've explained, you know, the ages at which you would like children to receive money, how you'd like your family to work. but I'd now like to interview you on tape and ask you some questions about this so that you can expand about why you're doing it this way, why you feel this way. And this kind of video record of what a wealth owner, business owner has in mind can go a long way to explaining the expectations, explaining why the wealth owner has put it this way. And I find that to be a very, very valuable thing. But before we leave the grandfather and we move on to some of the other family members, let me reinforce something that I said at the very beginning and that I said in our last webinar, and that is that money comes into every relationship. And it's naive, in my view, to think that it doesn't. And as a result, in and around grandfather, there are a lot of expectations. If grandfather is the one who is the wealth owner, there are a lot of expectations. And we just have to recognize that those expectations exist. And as a result, we need to test, are those expectations reasonable? We need to talk to the children. We need to talk to the grandfather, because it is not right or wrong. There is no right or wrong to say, we're not going to give any fish to the kids. We're only going to teach them how to fish. In other words, I'm not leaving any of my money to my children. Instead, I'm going to send them to the best business schools so that they know how to fish. They know how to make money, and they're on their own. Well, that's fine, but we need to explain that. We need to communicate that to the children if that's the decision. Or if the decision is, I am going to leave all my fish to my kids, then they should be aware of that too, but they should also be aware of my thinking of when I'm going to leave them all my fish. Is it going to only be when I die, so I'm going to have children who are just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for me to croak? Or am I going to make some of those assets available earlier? Communication is absolutely critical. And when you start getting grandfather into new relationships, you asked me to stay away from mistresses, so I won't talk about his 5 mistresses today, but he may marry again. Maybe his wife dies. Maybe there's a divorce and he marries a sweet young thing who's 23 years old when he's 75 or 80. Does she have any financial expectations? You'd be nuts to think that she doesn't. And those expectations are going to come into how we plan to protect the assets. Yeah. Now, when we look at other family members, and we're looking at grandmother, for example, it depends. Grandmother may be a business owner, she may be a wealth owner. Very typically, what we find dealing with grandparents in today's world, we're dealing with a different generation. And very often, as I suggested earlier, grandmother herself may have come from a business owning family, but suddenly her legacy has been taken over by grandfather. And very important as advisors and very important in creating happiness and also benefiting from what the family can offer, we want to find a real role for the matriarch. And we want to celebrate her legacy and what she can offer, and also recognize the reality that chances are she will live the longest within the family, and she will become a very important potential mediator of problems that may occur. And so we need to set that up, correctly. And also very important in the whole imposition, expectation, judgment triangle is to recognize that the more financial independence the matriarch has, the grandmother has, the happier she will be. And this is not just for grandmothers. What I worry about in a lot of families is they don't give enough thought to the critical importance of their children being financially independent, particularly being financially independent of their life partners, as well as financially independent of their parents and otherwise. The more you can create this independence, the happier they are. So if I have a daughter, rather than leaving her a big chunk of money at age 25, which she may spend, I may benefit her much more by leaving the assets in a way that ensure that she has enough money to walk out on her marriage anytime without worrying about the economics. That freedom, that protection of her may be the biggest gift that I can make. So families need to think about that. And with grandmother, having that in mind could be very, very important. And also discussing at the level of grandmother and the whole family the importance of separating business from family. Very often the families that we work with, they confuse business with family. And that creates a lot of unhappiness because grandfather, grandmother, they cannot separate family from business. And we need to separate family from business because while the family may support the business and the business creates the reason why the family is staying together, there will be a separation of what's in the best interest of the business and what's in the best interest in the family, and how do we make business decisions and how do we make family decisions, and these are two different areas.
I think one of the things that's very important, like you said, in terms of financial independence is one thing, but also having the ability to be able to manage or make decisions at the board level for the person who's going to be surviving, right? That's an element that we see is not being done. The work is not being done. Let's say if it's a homemaker, right? Without the homemaker, the male, female, doesn't matter, would not have been able to create what they created. I mean, including myself, right? If I take myself as an example, if my former wife had not spent the time and energy to raise the children, I wouldn't have been able to do what I did. But the question is, was enough time and energy and effort made to have her understand the financials so that if something were to happen to me, she would be able to make the decisions needed. Another thing I want to bring to Philip that's happening a lot in our culture is the fear of the matriarch or patriarch, in most of the cases it's the patriarch, of the charitable component that the matriarch may take a position on, and therefore they're limiting the fish they're giving because they're scared that a lot of the money will go to charity and not to the next gen. Are you experiencing this? Because I've sat with a lot of families on this topic, and as a result, they're limiting the fish because of that topic.
Yeah, so very interesting. So you've raised really 2 points that, let me comment on both points that you've raised. The first one has to do with preparation of family members. And you talk about the grandmother, the matriarch in the family, and preparing her well for her role. But my comments on preparation will also be relevant to all family members, including children, younger generation, etc. What I find in the families that I work with is all too often, almost all the preparation resources are put towards preparing the family members who are going to be running the family business for their roles. So we have, for example, 3 children. The daughter is like really into the business. She's gone to business school. You know, dad is involving her day to day. You know, she's one of the children. Then we have 2 sons, one of whom is a doctor. The other one is interested in art and is working in that area. What very often happens in a family is they put all the education, effort, and resource of preparation on the daughter who's going to be running the family business. And what they're not recognizing is that the 2 sons are actually in the future going to be owners of this business. They're not going to be necessarily managers, but they will be owners of the business. And they're going to have a critical role in supporting the daughter in what she's doing, regardless of what kind of ownership structure we have. So we need to prepare responsible owners of the business. And your example of the grandmother, Feisal, is spot on. We need to prepare her for the role she may play in the future, including, as I mentioned earlier, the mediation role she may have to play in relation to family disputes. And you're seeing that very often in Asia right at the moment, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and other places. In many family disputes, the matriarch, the grandmother, has the power to resolve disputes. You've seen this with the Ambanis in India. You've seen this in cases in Hong Kong and elsewhere. But have they really been prepared for that role? I'm not sure they have. And it is very effective for families to take that into account in how they prepare family members, including grandma, for her role in preventing and dealing with family disputes going forward. Now, on your second point, which is allergy to charity, fear of charity, yes, I see that very often historical issue. I see historical in that in a world of not wanting to pay any tax, have grandfathers and grandmothers who absolutely are terrified of to do is help families understand the desirability of having a flexibility that respects the younger generation. And it's interesting, I'm working with one family right now, and maybe that's an example I can give, where the father, dead set against charity and wanted to limit charity hugely, now has younger generation family members totally dedicated not so much to charity, but to the whole area of impact investment, which he was very skeptical about. But because the family, rather than prohibiting this kind of activity, are together learning about what this means, the father or the grandfather has now become very excited about this and is fully participating. So again, I would say in this area, it's about communication within the family, and charity is linked, in my view, although of course it's very different, to paying tax. A lot of grandfather, for example, have this complete aversion to paying tax because they grew up in a different environment when it was time when people were just hiding their money in Switzerland or Liechtenstein or wherever they were hiding their money, and everyone was not playing by the rules. The reality is, number one, the rules are being enforced today. There's a lot of transparency. You can't get away with what people used to get away with, number one. Number two, we're in an environment where it's just the wrong thing to be doing. We're in a world where there is massive inequality between those who have and those who don't, and wealth-owning families need to become more responsible. So this whole fear of charity, which I would extend into fear of tax, fear of doing the right thing, wanting to keep everything for the family, not trusting that your children and your wife will be responsible in their charitable giving, that's a mistake that needs to be addressed through greater communication.
I think I want to touch back on the first point about preparation. I mean, the other risk that we're seeing a lot more is not only the lack of preparation of the shareholder, the owner that you referred to, the two brothers who were not part of the business, and the sister who was, but also the power that's being given to the sister in terms of decision making, and how do we balance that, right? On one hand, they need to make the day-to-day, but how do you empower and make sure that the brothers have the ability to support the sister in order to take the business to the next level, which may include completely shifting, like you gave the Li Ka-shing, that they are there to provide the mirror to see blind spots that she may not be able to see, to move them into a completely different business, which is what makes sense. And they may have not only the skill set, but at least the understanding, right? So this is another thing. How do you protect the two brothers from the sister because they've been given so much power and that imbalance? And here you give an example of 3. If you take it to 50, 60 people, you can see it's completely imbalanced, right? You have 5, 7 members that are really part of the system, financially taken care of, etc. And the other are kind of along for the ride and don't feel really part of the decision-making process, even though they are core shareholders.
Yeah. And it's incredible how underinvested, how lacking in attention this area suffers. The reality is that for most business and wealth-owning families, they spend very, very little time thinking about what it is that we're discussing today. They do go to legal and tax advisors to set up trusts and shareholding agreements and companies and all these things. They're looking to minimize tax, but they're using advisors who, not wrongly, are focusing on what they're asked, which is, how do I pay the least amount of tax? How do I avoid this? How do I transfer to my kids? And what the advisors are not doing is exposing the family to the more holistic discussion that is absolutely necessary. And the kind of things that families really should be considering doing are having regular family retreats, family meetings that are supported by outsiders, such as yourself, who can help families ask the what ifs. And those what ifs are testing the structure that the family has. Okay, do you understand your own structure? What if this happens? What if one of the children falls out and wants to create problems? What happens? How is this decision made? How is that decision made? And by doing this constant what if testing, that allows the family as a collective to adapt the structure to being their structure that they believe in and they own. The worst thing is when the older generation dictate the future structure for the younger. And I've worked with some families, and this has worked very, very well, although it's sometimes challenging, where they've actually, the older generation has said to the kids, we want you to decide what kind of succession structure is going to work for your generation. When you've worked it out, present it to us, and if we like it, that's what we're going to adopt. Because it is the younger generation who have to then live with that, whole structure. Now, moving to the younger generation and the children, in our example, we've talked about some of the things about children, but one of the things about, I mentioned at the very outset, I said, Feisal, I said there are some expectations that are legitimate expectations. I think children have a lot of legitimate expectations that are not met and that parents should be considering. Now, among those legitimate expectations are the expectation to fairness. If I am one of 3 siblings, I have a legitimate expectation in my view that my parents will treat the 3 of us in a fair manner. Now, what does that mean more specifically? Well, if my brother is getting financial help from my parents because my brother didn't quite do as well as I did in terms of keeping focus on education and getting a job and doing all those things. So if my parents are helping him out, that's fine. But is it fair that in a way part of what I may inherit is being used to support my brother? And what if my brother starts having lots and lots of business ideas and my parents, being nice parents, are supporting his business ideas and they're not working out? Is that fair to me as one of the siblings? Because in a way, part of what may eventually be my money is being used for my brother's business. What if my brother does extremely well out of his business that was supported by my parents? Is it fair that I don't benefit at all from that? That's where fairness and expectation come into the picture and discussion within the family. Now, what I like in families is it doesn't matter what the formula is, but what I like is that there is articulation of what the formula will be. So if my parents are going to help out my brother, that's fine. But any special help they give to my brother should come out of his eventual share of any inheritance. And that way it's a bit more fair. And if there's a business that they're supporting, maybe it should be clear from the outset that 10% of that business belongs to the family as a whole. 90% of it is a loan to my brother that comes out of his inheritance. It doesn't matter what the figures are. What matters is this feeling of fairness, and with children, not waiting to communicate to them at the last minute. Is it fair that in a wealth owning family, a child is not told until they're in their 30s or 40s that they're not going to get any money until their mom and dad die, which may be at the age of 115? Is it fair to be told that at age 30? Is it not a legitimate expectation of a child in a wealthy family to think that they may get money earlier? And maybe they took their foot off the pedal in terms of what they studied or how they prepared themselves because they knew this family money or family business was there. Is it not a legitimate expectation? And for families who tell me, oh, don't worry, my kids don't know we're wealthy, what I say to them is, you're nuts. You have a driver, picking up your kid at school, they're in a private school, you've got a swimming pool in the backyard, you stay in 5-6-star hotels every time you go on holiday. If your kid looks on the internet, they can see your name is there as one of the wealthier families in your country. Of course they know you're wealthy. And if they know you're wealthy, maybe they have expectations that are unfounded regarding what they're going to get out of that wealth. And in fairness, the family should be discussing those expectations when the children are young, when they're able to make decisions that will impact their future. I myself, with our children, we had conversations about this when they were 12, 13, and 14 years old, where we said, look, there's money available to take care of you if we're not around, for health, for education, but you're not going to come into any serious money until way, way later, until you're in your 50s. And as a result, make your own decisions, what kind of lifestyles you want, what you want to study, what you want to do. We want you to be happy. We're here to help you. Having that conversation is very, very important in managing what I view as being legitimate expectations that family members have.
I want to challenge you on that, right? So I've been having a similar conversation like you have since the kids were 7, 9, 10, 12, everything on percentages and all of that. And one of the things I've made very clear is that there's no what I call fish or to put it rudely, piss money. And I've been challenged by many people around me as to whether the next generation truly believes, right? So I'll give you a real example. A year ago, I was at the dining table and my younger son turns to me and he says, so Baba, I want to understand something. So there's money for education. There's money for a family health office equivalent mandate. And there's money for an entrepreneurial fund to start companies. And these are serious numbers. But you're telling me that if I have no money for shelter and food, I have no access to any of it. And I said, and I looked at him, I said, that's yes. And he was completely baffled. And his mother happened to be across the table. And I said, that will be when you will make the best decisions because you are in that position. Now, a lot of people still tell me that they don't believe that the kids actually believe that. So have you encountered that? What is your view? How do you make it crystal clear without saying what I just shared?
Well, it's going to be an ongoing, well, I think you need to share. I mean, I think, you see, for me, there is no absolute right and absolute wrong in terms of what people do. What is the absolute wrong is to not communicate it. So I do run across a lot of families who say, we don't want to leave anything to the kids because we don't think it's good for them. Or we leave very little. We're going to give it all away to charity because we think everyone benefits from, starting fresh and making their own way. Perfectly rational thing for a parent to have decided. But what is highly dangerous is not communicating that in the right way to the children or treating it as a punishment somehow. That's the worst of all, where you're communicating with your wealth. So you really want to be, discussing this with your kids and then getting their input is the right thing. Now, what you raised was, do your kids really believe that there isn't more? And that's where I come back to expectation. They have expectations. They're coming from a wealthy family. They have expectations. They know you as a parent. They just cannot believe that you would leave them completely in the lurch. And here, it's legitimate for them to be raising this, and it's also legitimate for me to challenge what you said, Feisal. The way I would challenge you if I were advising is I'd say to you, okay, you've said that there's no money there for housing in a certain circumstance, that may come up. So if the kid doesn't come up with their own business, if they don't do this, there's no safety net, is what you're saying. I'm not giving a safety net. Well, I don't believe you either, just like your kid doesn't believe you. If you were alive and well 20 years from now, and one of your kids was really, really struggling, I believe you probably would end up helping them with their housing and all of that kind of basic necessities. I believe that. Now, what if you died in the interim? Is the structure that you've left behind, like a trust or whatever, flexible enough to act as a loving father would have acted? Or is it reflecting your dogmatic statement to your children that, you're not going to get any help unless you do this and this and this and this? Because you better be bloody sure what you really mean. Because if you're not really sure what you really mean, there is this dichotomy between what you really would do if you're alive and what whoever you've put in your place if you're not alive thinks that they should be doing. I would want as an advisor to be sure that you are crystal clear. And if you are crystal clear, your children will then believe you. Because if I'm sitting at the table with your kid and I've said, look, I didn't believe your dad either, but now that I've seen what he's done and what he's put in writing, you're getting dick if anything goes wrong, if you've not become an entrepreneur. So you better make plan B, kid, then we can be bloody clear about it.
And in terms of the in-laws, I mean, obviously in Europe, I see more and more prenups being mandatory if you want to be part of the shareholding of the next generation. Are you seeing that also in Asia as a requirement, that when it's bloodline only, or what are you seeing on that front?
Yeah,
Because
so
you talked about
yeah,
imposition and
let
expectation.
me make a couple of comments about all three, that are left: in-laws, business associates, and friends, so that you can then, take some questions from people and wrap
Yeah.
up our discussion. First of all, when it comes to in-laws, they're all in it for the money. They're all gold diggers. That's my view. So now I know it sounds a little bit aggressive. But I deal with all the messes within families, and I'm a great believer: hope for the best, but plan for the worst.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that there aren't nice, loving people out there in the world, but money comes into every relationship. And if it doesn't come into the relationship at the beginning, it's going to come into the relationship later on. When you find someone attractive, you find them attractive because they're smart, you find them attractive because they look good. You may also find them attractive because they come from a wealthy family, and they may come into money, and that's going to have an impact on your lifestyle. Look, it comes into it. And if it's going to come into it, the answer is simply, you must talk about financials upfront in every relationship. And the prenup, which you asked about, is one tool, one element of it. Yes, it's more and more common for families to require that there be prenups, but you want prenups to be discussed. You want to discuss as a parent prenups with your kids unrelated with the love of their life who they bring home. So therefore, critically important is discussing prenups, but also all the other things in and around divorce and relationships with your kids before they come home with the love of their life. If you say to your daughter when she comes home holding hands with her future husband, she says, "Mom, Dad, this is the guy I love, I'm going to marry him." You then say to your daughter, "Could we have a chat with you in the garage for a minute about prenups?" She's going to relate that to the judgment about what you think of the guy she just brought home. But if you have that conversation really early on, that can have a very, very big benefit. But also in all of this, when we talk about imposition, expectation, judgment, in-laws are very complicated animals, particularly in-laws coming into a wealthy business owning family. You may have very capable in-laws who are professionals, whatever they may be doing. They are somewhat devalued when they join a family that is a big business owning family. There are many psychological issues that impact the family business, that impact the family wealth, that should be thought about in that whole relationship with in-laws and what kind of role they're going to take. And similarly, when we talk about business associates, we come into the issue of, is it better for family members not to be involved in operating roles in the business? Maybe they should only be in ownership roles to really create opportunities for people in the business. How do we deal with tensions between family members, particularly younger generation, and executives who rightfully may feel that their path to the future in terms of promotions is affected by the fact that it's a family business? All of these things also come into this whole area of imposition, expectation, and judgment. And then finally, I want to mention with friends, not enough dialogue, in my view, within families about the reality that at one point or another, friends are going to try to borrow money from wealthy families. You're among your friends, you're always going to have some who are not doing quite as well. I don't know how you deal with this, but how we deal with it is really my wife's philosophy. Her philosophy, and I think it's a very good one, is we never, ever again lend money to friends. We do not lend money to friends. If friends need money, we will consider to give them some money if they need help, if they're really in bad shape, but only without the expectation of being repaid. Because any situation we've had personally, and I've seen this also in others, where you've loaned money to friends who've gotten into trouble, generally that's the end of the friendship, because the money doesn't come back. It's creating a lot of bad feeling. And the earlier to discuss this area with your kids and how they might deal with their own friendships in the future can be very important.
I think even worse than that has happened, where you not only help the friend, but you build a business, you help them create a business by funding it, and have a shareholding. So that's even makes life even more complicated, right? So I agree with you. We share the same philosophy. If you're going to give, and that's it. Write it off, and don't as a gift.
Yeah,
I think
don't
that's what
expect you're going to get it back,
Yes.
and we've lost friendships where we didn't do that in our early years, when we were younger, and
Yeah.
I think everyone goes through that experience, and that's one of the things the older generation should discuss with their kids, because expectation, imposition, judgment, this all comes into every relationship, the things we're talking about today.
So I'll just take a couple of questions. So here, first one says, how do you empower female wealth owners in a male-dominated financial industry, but also in their own family?
Well, I ran a program recently in Hong Kong, which was financial empowerment of women. And it was very interesting because we had a group attending that ranged between some women who were, just working on their own with relatively modest amounts of money, all the way to families in the billions. We had a really interesting, discussion and dialogue. But the bottom line is, it's all about education and preparation. And, sadly, there is a reality that the women tend to not be as well prepared financially as they should be. And so in the thing that I did in Hong Kong recently, and I've done it elsewhere before, together with a friend of mine who's an independent asset manager in Switzerland, together with a friend of mine who's a barrister on family law issues, the three of us ran a full day talking about, what do you need to know to understand your role in the family, to understand your role in the family structures, to know how to read a bank statement, to understand how banks charge, to understand your rights under family law, prenups and divorces and all of these things. These are all the elements that come into it. The other thing that I want to mention here is that we do run across, of course, many families in Asia and also elsewhere who still have this philosophy of, well, women have a different role. Only the male line inherit. Only the women can do this. Only the women can do that. I push back on this. Because, of course, there are cultural differences between families, but what I see all too often are parents who are using the culture of the grandparents, of their parents, to dictate inheritance to a generation that doesn't share that culture. And families are really losing out if they do not explore how to evolve and make sure that they are making use of all possible resources the family has, which includes, of course, female family members. So there is a lot of discussion in and around this area that is needed.
Yeah. So the other question is, what about when kids have to start taking care financially for their parents? Should it be a gift or a loan to potential future heritage? So I guess it's talking about maybe the in-laws, right? Because, so it won't be the parents, obviously, that are giving the money, but, once you're married, it's both sides, because you consider both sides as your parents. So I'm assuming that's the question, that would it be a gift or a loan?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, we're talking about kids taking care of their parents. And should it be a gift or a loan? I'd back up a little bit and just say that whole issue of kids taking care of their parents needs a lot of discussion and thought, because it's not every kid who's going to take care of their parents. And I think that every older generation should really be thinking through carefully, how are decisions going to be made about, my well-being as I get older and I become dependent on others. And there are lots of financial issues that come in here too, because from a tax legal point of view, it's sometimes attractive for the older generation to give everything away early, because tax-wise that may be beneficial. They may then find themselves overly dependent on their children. And I'm of the view, don't trust anybody, including your children. And I know that they can be trusted sometimes, but the starting point should be, don't trust them. Now, in terms of, taking care of parents, should it be a gift or a loan to the parents? There could be some tax issues depending where the grandparents live that will impact this. But for me, the tax side of it is so much less important than the psychological and real issues in and around, how are decisions going to be made as people age, who's going to make those decisions, who has the right to pull the plug or not pull the plug, how will they be taken care of financially, and how dependent does an older person want to be on their own children going forward. And in the end, what's right and wrong is probably a balance. I'm a great believer in giving a lot of what you have away before you die. Equally, I'm a great believer in not giving it all away, because you shouldn't trust anybody.
Yeah, so this was actually the wealth creator paying for his parents. They just clarified. So it's actually the wealth creator paying for his parents, and obviously he's leaving money behind. So it's
so the wealth creator, taking care of his parents. When you say, a loan versus a gift, probably it should be a gift. It'll depend a little bit on the circumstances, but clarity is very important. Yeah. Clarity is very important.
All right, Philip, we're at 2 past the hour. I think we've come through. I want to really thank you very much for doing this dialogue and taking a leap of faith. I know that fundamentally, I mean, we both know that the statistics are against us, right? Second to third gen, it's 30% success rate, and third to fourth gen is only 9%. And the reality is that 60% of the issues are communication, exactly what you touched upon, and from that space, another 10% is due to trust, right? Which is not built because of lack of clarity and unfortunately, expectations, judgment, or imposition, valid or invalid. I mean, I never thought of that element until you brought it up.
I want to add to what you just said. Where you talk about success rates. Your success in what you've described is success in preserving the family business and the family wealth. I don't necessarily view that as being success. Maybe it is. It's one element of success, but I think real success needs also that every family member feels good about themselves, is happy, and is having the kind of life that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents would have wanted them to have. And that's not only about, has the family business survived and thrived? That's also about, has imposition, expectation, and judgment ruined my life? And also ruined my ability to contribute to my family and contribute to the family business. So, we're dealing with, I don't want to use the word complicated areas. Yes, it's complicated. We're dealing with areas that are multifaceted and need a holistic approach. And it's not all about tax. It's not all about law. It's not all about psychology. And you're not going to get the answer from a psychiatrist or psychologist or from a lawyer. You're going to get the answer from a group approach of dialogue and work to deal with these areas.
No, but that's the thing, right? I'll just end with a note. I was sitting with a couple, and they were telling me that, there's so much stuff. And I said, how would you like to take this 40-foot container of stuff and bring it into an essential backpack? And the wife looked at me and said, is that really possible? And that's what we're talking about, right? Is how do we, before somebody comes to you, for example, Philip or Roger or somebody incredible that's able to go through the key elements of the hard stuff, how do we prepare them for the soft stuff so that when they come to you, they only focus on the essentials, right? So that we can get, what we talked about. When I meant success, I didn't mean success. It's to be able to transition from generation to generation, irrespective of whether it's wealth or the business itself. But I know the statistics you're referring to, but communication is key. So thank you very much, Philip. I'm glad that we get to agree and disagree as we dialogue, which is the fun part of life. And yeah, I hope that we're able to do more conversations on this topic, because I truly feel this is where the make or break is, in terms of, like you said, having people fully express themselves, the God within them fully expressed, or limited based on the expectation, judgments, and impositions by either the generation above or even sideways, right? Yeah. And at times it's even below, right? It's also coming from the bottom up, right? Which is something that's happening, which we didn't touch upon.
Absolutely, and always changing. So this is not work that families do one time. It's an ongoing thing because relationships change, the children age, all kinds of things. The only thing we can be sure of is change. Change in the outside world, change in the business, change in the family. And this is interesting work, but it's 2% of the families that I work with, 5% maximum, are really engaging in doing this. And it actually is work where a lot of it they can be doing on their own, but they need some input in terms of having a framework under which to do this work.
Well, it's our mission as you know, the work I do, to actually bring this to the forefront. And as you said, right, for the well-being of the family members. And I really thank you once again for helping me explore this topic, you know, from a balanced state of bringing it from the hard side and the soft side, and able to eloquently discuss it. So thank you very much, Philip. Thank you everyone for your time, the generosity of your time and engagement. Sorry we couldn't take too many of your questions. We're more than happy to, you know, if you emailed us, we're more than happy to share and respond and create dialogue. Philip and I have decided to write a couple of articles, so we will share them with you as we move forward. And next week we have Kathleen back looking at mastering your emotions. As the last two webinars she ran, that was one of the topics that was really coming up, especially in the Q&A. And the week after, it's not written here, we're going to be looking at gut health and brain health with Michel Gollet, who is an incredible, we call him the magician, based in Geneva, works with a lot of the top athletes in the world and beyond. So again, thank you very much, everyone. Philip, once again, thank you. Wish you a beautiful day. I know it's very early for you now. Your day's just beginning. And bon appetit to those in Hong Kong who haven't had their dinner, and those soon in Dubai. All right? Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye.